You may remember that the disciples, Peter speaking for them, confessed Jesus as the Christ way back in Luke 9, and now Jesus is confessing himself to be the Christ publicly in Luke 22, and he's being killed for it. People don't believe him. But this is the same confession that Jesus is the Christ. And what all of Luke is telling us is what it means that Jesus is the Christ. And we're going to see in this passage today that the events of Jesus' arrest and trial all revolve around what does it mean that Jesus is the Christ. And Jesus both shows us and tells us what it means that he's the Christ. And a lot of these things are ideas that are true at the same time, that are apparently in contrast about Jesus. Jesus is both God and man, and that's part of what it means to be the Christ. And we can't quite wrap our head around how you can be two things at once like that. But that's what the Bible is teaching us, and we'll see that through this passage. So here's how it starts, with Jesus surrendering his will to God the Father. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. That's where they've been going to sleep every night during this week. And on reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." And an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And when he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." The disciples are asleep, which is the opposite of what Jesus is telling them to do. The night of the Passover, in Exodus 12, it says, God kept vigil to bring you out, so you should keep vigil or keep watch as a way of remembering. And it might be that this is part of the normal Passover celebration, is you stay up late because God stayed up late to protect them in the Passover. They're also not keeping watch like Jesus said to do for him to return, for him to come as king. He's coming into his kingdom right now in a significant way, and they're falling asleep through it. And Jesus is praying as he taught us to pray. Do you notice that? He's praying to God, his Father. He's saying to God, your will be done. He's saying, take this cup from me if you can. But he's saying, not my will, but your will be done. Even the take this cup seems connected to give us this day our daily bread and take away from me this bad cup. It's the cup of God's wrath. And he's telling his disciples multiple times to pray that they will not be led into temptation. These are the elements of the Lord's Prayer. Jesus is praying as he taught to pray. And this cup that he's talking about is the cup of God's wrath. Throughout the Old Testament, it's a picture of God either pouring out his wrath or making you drink it. And Jesus is saying, I am not looking forward to drinking this cup of wrath, but I will submit to you. Do you see how this is a connection? We talked about this in Sunday school. This has been one of the main passages for trying to understand what it means that Jesus is both God and man. He is part of the Trinity, who is God with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. How can Jesus want to go to the cross and not want to go to the cross at the same time? And a big part of this is the way that Jesus is both God and man. However, even us, just having one human nature, have you ever wanted two things at the same time? Have you, let's see, what was the best example we came up with in Sunday school? Have you wanted to lose weight and wanted to eat a whole carton of ice cream at the same time? Yeah. In our experience, we have examples of wanting two things and to ask God's help for one of our desires to win over the other one. And Jesus is saying, I want to do what you want me to here. I want to go to the cross, but I also humanly don't want to do this. And God helped Jesus with that. And there's a way to take our struggles to God in ways that aren't sinful, to even be in agony and to be, sometimes we get twisted up about not worrying. We're told not to worry in the Bible. But sometimes we get twisted up about not worrying, so feeling guilty for worrying. The idea is to take your worries to God, give them to him, and let him help you through them. Don't get caught up on the fact that you're anguishing, and now I'm guilty for anguishing and all of that. Jesus was perfectly sinless as he took this real struggle to God and got through it. And you know what? An angel showed up to strengthen Jesus here too. Do you know that when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, it talks about the angels coming to help him in that time. And Luke says at the end of it that Satan left Jesus until a more opportune time. And the fact that an angel is back helping him here is an indication that this is probably the time that Luke was talking about. The devil is back to try to tempt Jesus one more time. And we're going to see that Jesus says this hour. So while he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. And he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear, and he healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. Do you hear that accusation? The opposite of the Lord's Prayer, God's kingdom coming. Instead, this is the time when darkness reigns. He's telling them that they are in league with Satan, which he's already told us about Judas at this point also. Judas is one of the 12. That should make us think of this as a representative of the disciples betraying Jesus. Also, the fact that Judas's name is Judah, the 12, this is a representation of God's own people, Israel, turning Jesus over. Jesus was betrayed by his own people, both his disciples and the Jews here. And one of them, we find out from John that it's Peter, chops off an ear. John also tells us that that guy's name was Malchus. John fills in some details here. Cuts off his ears. And I've seen lots of commentaries try to talk about the fact that you should not cut off the ears of people coming to Jesus. Meaning, don't block the message from getting to these people. Somebody else said, yeah, but this guy was listening to the high priest, so, you do have to cut off bad messages coming to people. And maybe there's some symbolic stuff going on with ears here, but I think Peter was probably just a really bad shot with a sword here. You either have to be really good or really bad to only get an ear. Okay? And then Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. Jesus is going to use this at his trial again also. And when they start fighting, Jesus says, no more of this. That's what he said about the swords when he told them to bring them with. He said, enough of this. This isn't the plan. He says to the guards, am I leading a rebellion? And you could say, yeah, that guy just... And then Jesus heals him, and you go, okay, I guess you're not healing. You're not leading a rebellion. You're healing the people who your disciples are trying to hurt here. That's the charge that Jesus is going to be executed for, leading a rebellion and insurrection. That's the charge that he will be condemned for in the Roman court of law. And it's not true, and Jesus is saying that from the beginning here. So the story continues. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest, and Peter followed at a distance. But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight, and she looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." In other words, Peter was with Jesus. But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Then the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. Notice how much communication is happening by looks in this. We have a servant girl who looked closely at Peter. We have someone else saw him, and it ends with the Lord looking straight at Peter. He didn't say anything, but Peter knew Jesus knows what I just did. And Peter's confession of Jesus back from Luke 9, "You're the Christ," now he's denying he even knows him. And Jesus is about to confess publicly what he told his disciples not to tell anyone yet. He's about to confess it publicly. Jesus and Peter are acting oppositely here. Jesus is being denied and betrayed by his disciples, and Jesus is about to openly confess that he's the Christ. And the rooster crows. There's some argument about whether this is just a rooster in the distance crowing, or whether they had someone who pretended to be a rooster to crow at dawn to tell you what time it was. Because the very next verse after this tells us that at daybreak this happened. Either way, whether this is an artificial rooster or a real rooster crowing, this is sunrise of the same night where they just ate the Passover meal. Jesus said, "You're going to betray me." They said, "No, we'll never." And now, before the sun has even come up, Peter's denied him 3 times, just like he said he would. And he wept bitterly. Peter is really sad about this. But you know what the interesting thing at this point is? Matthew tells us that Judas was very remorseful about what he did also. Neither of them have gone to Jesus to ask for forgiveness. It's just good that Peter didn't give up. He had his sin forgiven. He waited the 3 days and was able to talk to Jesus about this. We have the story in John 20 of Jesus forgiving Peter's sin. And if you've sinned, it's right to be sad about your sin. But if your sadness doesn't cause you to take your sin to Jesus to be forgiven, your sadness is not helping you. Our sadness is designed to motivate us to go to Jesus. Because what is Jesus doing through this? He's forgiving sin. That's what he's doing. Your sin can be forgiven. Your sadness for sin can be taken to Jesus because Jesus went through all of that anguish, drank the full cup of God's wrath against your sin that you are sad about. If he'll forgive it all. That's the gospel. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Christ," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." And they all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he replied, "You are right in saying, I am." They said, "Why do we need any more testimony? You've heard it from his own lips." Okay, this is the council, the Sanhedrin. It's what the Gospels call it. These are the official leaders. Jesus told us in his parables that the tenants of the vineyard, the official builders, are the one rejecting the son of the vineyard owner, the stone that God is using to build his house, he's being rejected by the official group that should be receiving him. They ask him who he was, and Jesus says, I'll tell you, I'm the Son of Man. I'm the one who's going to judge you at the final judgment. If I asked you, you wouldn't be able to tell me. You wouldn't answer honestly. Yeah, you are fulfilling the Old Testament here. But I'll tell you, I'm the Son of Man. And then Jesus ends with a lot of titles about the Christ here. Remember, this passage is a Christology passage. It's telling us what the Christ is like. Let's see what Jesus says about himself here. Okay? First of all, there are parallels, again, between what Jesus says here and what Jesus explained when Peter confessed him. And it's interesting that Paul says in 1 Timothy that Jesus made the good confession that Timothy made while he for. In other words, Paul is saying our confession about Jesus needs to match what Jesus' confession about himself was. Makes sense, right? We should believe about Jesus what Jesus believed about himself. So here's what he said. They asked, "Are you the Christ?" That's the Greek word for the Messiah, the anointed one. It's the reason we call ourselves Christians. We believe Jesus is the Christ. It's the reason we call ourselves Messianic. We believe Jesus is the Messiah. He's the anointed one who is coming. And Jesus told his disciples that the Christ would die. When they said, "You're the Christ," back in 9, Jesus immediately said, "Yep, I'm going to die." That's part of what it means to be the Christ. But Jesus, in preaching at the temple, also asked the leaders, he said, "Whose son is the Christ?" And they answered from the Psalms. By definition, the Christ is the anointed one, the one coming, the anointed king in the line of David. That's whose son he is. And Jesus quoted from Psalm 110:1 to say, whoever the Christ is called God in the Old Testament by David. So the Christ is going to die, and he's God. That's what he's already taught us. I think that's a big piece of why Jesus is in trouble here. They know what Jesus is claiming about the Christ. But then Jesus keeps using this title for himself, the Son of Man, which comes from Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, there's this Son of Man, a human, who's led into God's presence, and he sits down next to God to rule forever and be worshiped by all the people, and God is okay with this, and he's the one who judges at the final judgment, which is where we're at in Daniel 7. You see that Jesus is being judged by this court, and Jesus' response is, they say, "Are you the Christ?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm the Christ. I'm the Son of Man. At the final judgment, the roles are going to be reversed here. I'm the judge. I'm the judge." Remember, Jesus already said back in the garden, he said, "This is who I am, I'm the Son of Man." And Jesus taught about his coming on the clouds of heaven as the Son of Man from Daniel 7. He is the judge. He's already ruling, already being worshiped, and he will return to judge. And that's what he's talking about with being seated at the right hand of God. Remember, he taught that's from Psalm 110:1, which teaches that the Messiah is also God. God calls him God. He's quoting that passage again. He also says he's the Son of God. Remember, since Jesus' birth, he's been called the Son of God. At his baptism, God said out loud, "This is my Son whom I love." The devil tempted Jesus to doubt that he was the Son of God. He kept saying, "If you are the Son of God." He is the Son of God, and the Son of God is actually another title for the Messiah from the Old Testament. So what we see that Jesus is saying, "I'm the Christ who will die, who is God and the Son of God, the judge of the final judgment," and then he throws in his answer, "You are right in saying, I am." He just casually uses another name for God here. The I am is the name where we get the name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah, from the Old Testament. It's how God introduced himself at the burning bush. During that same section where they're asking questions back and forth at the temple, and Jesus says that whoever the Christ is will also be God, he told the story of the burning bush to show that God raises the dead. And now he's using God's own line from the burning bush to say, "I am. I'm the one who was talking to God from the burning bush." Now, this is casually thrown in a way that, to us, especially as English speakers, it just looks like he's saying, it's me. But to use the line, I am, the way he did, is using God's name for himself this way. Okay? So they say, yeah, we don't believe that. You just said all of that. We don't believe that about you. And Jesus is condemned by the Jewish council for his claim to be Christ. What he's being condemned for is the religious implications of being Christ. They say, we don't believe you're the Christ because you're saying that about yourself. You're claiming to be God and we don't believe it. But now they're about to turn him over to a Roman court that doesn't care about this religious claim. And they're now going to translate this religious claim into a political claim for his next trial. Jesus is the Christ, both religiously and politically. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be the Christ, a king. So Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and he's come all the way here. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was in Jerusalem at that time. They're lying about what Jesus said about paying taxes to Caesar. They asked him this question in that same time when Jesus said that the Christ was God. And he said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. If Caesar wants his money back, give it to him. And now they've handed Jesus over to Caesar, which they should not have done. The one in God's own image they've given over to this. And now the charge is that Jesus is the king of the Jews. Jesus says, yes, I am the king of the Jews. Pilate says, yes, he is the king of the Jews. Only the Jews are the ones who are bothered by this. Isn't that interesting? Pilate and Herod have been fighting. It's interesting. Pilate, Herod, and the Jews are all introduced by Luke in Luke chapter 3 at Jesus' baptism. They're the leaders. And they're kind of in a tug of war, and they're using Jesus now as a way of fighting with each other. I don't think that Pilate is being super nice by transferring him over into Herod's court. Secular history shows that Pilate and Herod had a lot of conflicts, and they used the Jews kind of as tug of war for their fight, and now they're using Jesus as tug of war for their fight. And Pilate is going to win, kind of come out being on top in this three-way tug of war between Pilate, Herod, and the Jews. So he goes to Herod this way. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him, and Pilate and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, dressing him in an elegant robe. They sent him back to Pilate. And that day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Herod has been wanting to see Jesus since he killed John, says that back in Luke chapter 9. And Herod asks Jesus questions that Jesus won't even dignify with an answer. If you ask Jesus, are you the Christ, meaning religiously, Jesus says, yes. If you ask Jesus, are you the king of the Jews, meaning the Christ politically, Jesus says, yes. But if you're just toying with him, Jesus didn't say anything. And Herod is actively participating in the mocking here. Remember when the soldiers were beating up Jesus? John says that the high priest commanded Jesus be struck. So it's not only the soldiers under their command, this is semi-official mocking of Jesus that's being condoned by Herod and even by the high priest up to this point. And again, Pilate is coming out politically ahead with Herod and with the Jews. Herod liked this. Herod thought this was pretty cool that he got to see Jesus. And he sends him back to Pilate. And we're going to see how Pilate scores points over the Jews here. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and he said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him, then release him. By the way, that's not the definition of justice. He's innocent, so let's punish him. Jesus is innocent. Pilate says he's innocent. Herod says he's innocent. And you notice what the charge is here? It's inciting rebellion. Jesus said he was innocent of at the garden. And Pilate confirms he's innocent. But now, Jesus is going to take the punishment for a sin he's not guilty of. He's going to drink the cup of God's wrath for sin he's not guilty of. With one voice, they away with this man, release Barabbas to us. Barabbas had been thrown in prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time he spoke to him. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished, then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and they surrendered Jesus to their will. First of all, do you see how Pilate won the political points here? They're accusing Jesus of being an insurrection, a rebel leader. And so Jesus takes a convicted rebel leader and says, "Do you really care about rebellion?" And they said, "No, we want to kill Jesus who didn't do this and let who did do it free." You see that? He's won the political points here. He's made the Jews, the Jewish leaders, say, "We don't like Jesus, that's why we want to kill him." Now, he buckled to their demands, but Pilate is not a great guy who's just trying to do the right thing here. Pilate is a politician in the middle of a tug of war that Jesus is in the middle of. He does try to release him 3 times and affirms over and over that he's innocent, and instead releases Barabbas. Barabbas is an interesting name. Bar is son of, and Abba is father. He's the son of the Father. Not a very creative name. We are all Father's sons. But it's interesting that Barabbas it's being contrasted. Jesus is the Son of God the Father, who is dying for a crime he didn't commit, and a son of a father is being released to freedom here. He's guilty of the crime that Jesus is being accused of, and he gets off free, and Jesus, who is innocent, takes the guilt. It's a direct trade. We are Barabbas. We are actually guilty of our sin and deserve to die for it, and instead, Jesus steps in and takes it. And because of that, we get to be God's sons because of that. Do you also notice one more thing? Jesus is surrendered to the people's will. Do you remember how this all started? With Jesus praying in the garden, that he would surrender his own will to God the Father. And God's will is that Jesus die. And the people's will is that Jesus die. And Jesus is surrendered to both of their wills here. But God's the one who's actually in charge. God is using the worst sin ever to bring about the best results ever. Killing God is probably the worst thing you could possibly do. And that's what they're doing. And that's what saves us. So here's how this is all teaching us about Jesus. Jesus is showing and telling us what it means that he is the Christ with these pairs of contrasting ideas we've seen. You notice Jesus surrendered his will to his Father's will. And now he's being surrendered to the people's will. He is both dying because God wants him to die and dying because people are evil. Those things are both true at the same time. And the gospel is that in Jesus, your sin is forgiven, and God, it's his will to punish our sins on Jesus to fulfill God's will and give us this gift to forgive us. You notice we had contrasting confessions here also. We have Peter who says he doesn't even know Jesus, while Jesus says, I am the Christ. He boldly confesses it. And in Jesus, your sin of failing to confess Jesus is forgiven, because Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, who is giving himself for us. We also have about Jesus being declared innocent of insurrection or rebellion and being executed in the place of someone who is guilty of this same crime. And in Jesus, your sin is forgiven because Jesus is God and man, the man who can stand in our place, even though he's innocent, and take our sin, so that he can give us his position as a son of God, and then invite us to pray as he prayed. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, we are standing in our position as Jesus invited us to do, standing, saying that we're accepting this gift of forgiveness that he's given us. We can talk to God as our Father and us as our sons. In Jesus, your sin is forgiven because he took your sin, and you are declared to be God's son in him.